As Elizabeth did not leave the heirs, in 1603 James I, King of Stuarts and Elizabeth's relative, ascended to the throne, giving rise to the Stuart dynasty. There is a very interesting detail that is important that I explain to you, so that everything makes more sense. Although it was not something new, based on the studies, a practice intensified the privatization of land. In fact, the lands that were for collective use were sometimes sold to private individuals. This practice was known as enclosures, or in English, enclosures. With the Anglican reform, church lands were expropriated, increasing the stock of land for collective use. Much of the land was sold to the English bourgeoisie, which was beginning to differentiate itself from the other bourgeoisie in Europe. Land ownership was not a feature in general of the bourgeoisie, but of the nobility. And it is this detail that makes the English bourgeoisie end up being known as gentry. Enclosure affected many people who survived on collective lands. Of course, dissatisfaction increased, as did inequality. It is this inequality that would later end up fomenting radical movements like the Levers, which in plain English are levelers. In the context of the Puritan Revolution, which we are going to study in a moment, there was also a group that proclaimed themselves to be true levers. They defended a collectivization of the lands. This group is not to be confused with the libelles. They said they were the real libelles. This group became known as diggers, in good Portuguese, diggers. They ended up massacred by the new model Hermie. Want to know what this is? I'll tell you later. Another ingredient for understanding the English revolutions is the religious factor. You know, of course, that since 1534, with the Act of Supremacy, England had broken with the Catholic Church, and had its own church, the Anglican Church. It is not difficult to imagine that this institutional rupture would not break with the faith and the mental bonds that a good part of the English had with the Church. In this context, persecution of Catholics began in the country, but in addition to Catholics, other religions, entertainers and Protestants, also ended up suffering persecution from the Crown. For you to have an idea, Scotland, the country of origin of Stuart James I, had a strong presence of Presbyterianism. The English Parliament was a parliament in absolutist England. So, a good part of the Parliament was Calvinist current, known in England as Puritans. This instability even led to assassination attempts on both Elizabeth I and James I. Speaking of James I, his Protestant background brought him certain convictions that differed from the traditional English view of religion. Guided by the divine right of kings, Jaime argued that power was transmitted by God directly to the king. Therefore, he only owed satisfaction to God himself, and to no one else. The authoritarian position of the Stuart king did not contribute in the slightest to internal conciliation. In 1625, James I died and the crown passed to his son Charles I. With serious problems, Carlos I was forced to summon the parliament, which put him on the wall, forcing him to sign a document that limited his powers. For example, to create new taxes, Parliament should authorize prohibition of martial law in times of peace, end of arbitrary arrests and others. The king ended up leaving for ignorance and said enough. He gathered troops, closed Parliament and even arrested some members to show who was in charge of that bodega. In 1640, however, revolts in Scotland and Ireland deepened the depletion of royal finances, and Charles I found it necessary to convene Parliament in English after almost 12 years, a very long period if we consider English tradition. This new Parliament created a series of laws with an obligation to convene Parliament every 3 years, in addition to other requirements, such as greater control over the performance of the king's ministers. I doubt you guessed what the king did on hearing this. I told you you'd get it wrong, didn't I? He didn't accept it and tried to close Parliament again.
Oi?
Hey, you're right?
Então.
Oh, so congratulations. But do you think he managed to close Parliament? No. Resistance began. But it is not just any kind of resistance. In fact, a civil war was beginning in England at that moment. Things got really ugly. There were 9 years of conflict between 1640 and 1649. A parliament was led by Oliver Cromwell, and his army became known as the Roundheads, while the king's army was called the Knights. If tradition counted and we were going to bet, we would put all the chips in the king. After all, the military advantage was his, which had the traditional warrior nobility. Not to mention the advantage of having a larger cavalry, and you already saw in our class on the conquest of America the advantages of a horse on the battlefield of the modern period. However, the rigid hierarchy of the king's army did not reward meritocracy, but noble birth. In contrast, Cromwell's army, even without the experience of the knights, was organized in a hierarchy of competence. The most Habes won promotions proportionate to their ability, regardless of wealth or social position. There, the new model army emerged, which gradually allowed the numerous infantry of the Roundheads to slowly defeat the king's knights. The king was defeated and arrested, then released, but the guy was hopeless. He tried to organize a new resistance. Then the patience of Parliament came to an end. He was again arrested and tried for treason. The verdict was death by decapitation, something unheard of in modern European history.
Ray was judged and killed by another instance of power.
Maybe you don't find it so striking, but do you know what the king's remark was about his conviction for treason? That he could not understand the accusation of treason, since treason means treason to the king, that is, to the majesty. Note that the world was changing and even the practical meaning of betrayal was undergoing transformations. As a large part of the parliament was made up of Puritans, this revolution went down in history as a Puritan revolution. With the victory of the parliament, England became a republic, formed the Commonwealth.
At that time, investments were being made in the navy with the aim of gaining maritime hegemony, including in the merchant navy.
At that moment, English interests ended up bumping into the interests of the Dutch war companies, with whom they had a 2-year confrontation there between 1652 and 1654. Oliver Cromwell, with the aim of encouraging English investments in the naval industry, launches the so-called Navigation Acts.
With these acts, in addition to expanding English control over the overseas colonies, ships were prohibited from entering English ports and their colonies if they did not fly English flags.
The exception was for ships flying the flag of the transported goods. However, even so, part of the crew had to be English. With that, a problem was created, because the supply of English ships was initially insufficient. With that, the value of the freight ended up becoming very high. The rest the law of the market solved. High freight rates attract investments to the naval sector. In a short time, the English merchant navy surpassed the Dutch one. Although, at the end of the war with the king and the victory of Parliament, he defended that power cannot originate in blood, but in merit, as demonstrated by the new model army. In 1653, Parliament appointed Cromwell Lord Protector of England, Scotland, Gales and Ireland. Small remark, the title was hereditary. Lord Cromwell would not remain long with the Lord Protector. 5 years later, passes the title to his son, dies with the hereditary title. His son Richard Cromwell assumes power.
It is soon noticed that skills are not necessarily hereditary.
Richard's political inability is perceived by everyone, especially by that institution that was organized hierarchically through skills and merits, the army.
And it is this army that ends up deposing Richard Cromwell. The army's constant interference in politics began to frighten the nobility, who perhaps weren't used to seeing many competent people together.
It is in this context that the nobility began to articulate the monarchical restoration, or restoration of the Stuarts, as it also usually appears in the evidence. In 1660, Parliament declared the son of the beheaded king the new monarch of England. With that, the situation was pacified and the new king was crowned as Charles II. But of course, religious issues were still tense, such as the persecution of Quakers, a Protestant line that disagreed with the religious models practiced in England. Persecuted, the Quakers ended up emigrating to America, founding the Pennsylvania colony.